from you.
Well, you just said. You
I
said
said it was a
earlier.
central
Well, you
question
said it was an
philosophy?
eternal.
Imponderable.
No, but before that, you said it was you know, we'll have to rewind the video, but
Yeah.
I think you tried to make it appear as if it was somehow an important question.
Okay.
Was it? Is it an important question? Or
It's
is
an
it-
interesting question, but it's unanswerable by virtue of its structure and its nature. It's an example of the limits of the human mind.
But what physics does is take questions that are unanswerable and turn them into questions that you can try and achieve an answer to.
Well, if it has,
even philosophy.
it has to change the question, that's not progress.
Philosophy does that too. I'm sorry. I think philosophy takes questions that are poorly framed. I mean, look,
No,
I make fun.
People
claim I make fun of philosophy, but philosophy is central. We all do philosophy. What philosophy does, by rational, clear, and critical thinking, is to try and take vague questions and turn them into precise questions, which you can decide upon whether they're answerable or not, and then you can proceed by reason. And in my case, you know, I don't distinguish between philosophy and science. Science is just empirical evidence, because that's the only, in my opinion, source of knowledge, supplemented by reason, and they come together. Now, some people call the reason philosophy and the empirical evidence science, but to me, the process of science is to take empirical evidence, use rational thinking, and combine the two. And that's what philosophy does in all of its best cases. Philosophy bases itself on evidence, tries to establish extremely precise, critical, logical steps of thinking to determine what questions are reasonable, how to frame questions that are reasonable, what lines of thought might be productive, and you know, so that's sort of science. I don't think there's any distinction between those two.
So we agree I'm right.
Yeah.
Okay. But we do agree, I think, you're not answering the question that philosophers
No, we don't agree. Well, I don't know what philosophers are asking. Sorry. I can't, if I'm not asking a question that's vague and ill-defined, you're right. I'm sorry.
They're asking how you get from nothing, nothing, nothing.
I mean
But
nothing.
there's no
No
sense
laws, no space, no time, no particles.
No
Now,
sense in
that may not be nothing. Fine. But at least I defined it. But I'm just a physicist, so that means I'm inherently kind of a heathen. I mean, I just tried to define what I say. And I think if you read my book, I very clearly define what I mean, and I never claim to describe anything that I don't define. Sorry. Go on.
Okay. So we'll before long get to Q&A. Let me ask you a couple of things. Just, there's a phrase that you say, if you could just briefly tell me what you mean by this, that you're recently. The more we learn about the workings of the universe, the more purposeless it seems. Do you mean the more we understand about just the machinery, why things happen?
There's no evidence that there's any purpose behind the universe, yeah.
Okay. But I mean...
Does that mean there's no purpose? I don't claim there isn't.
But I mean, if you think of it as like a deistic purpose, you know, like a God who wound the thing up, then further exploration of the mechanics don't really shed a lot of further light, right?
Oh, I said what I mean. There's no evidence of purpose in the universe. Does that mean there's no purpose? Absolutely not. It just means there's no evidence for purpose. So, but you know, it seems to me, you know, as scientists, we don't say, what we can say is something's likely or not likely. Mm-hmm. And we can even sometimes quantify the level of likeliness. That's all we can do. And so you can say, you know, are there evidence of unicorns? Okay?
Well,
and I can't prove there aren't unicorns, but I can say there's no evidence for unicorns. It's highly unlikely there are unicorns.
What would evidence of purpose look like?
Okay, if I looked up tonight on the sky, if it were clear, mm-hmm. and the sky rearranged itself and said in ancient Aramaic or, you know, English, because mm-hmm. apparently God speaks English,
okay.
I am here. You know, that'd be pretty convincing to me that there's something going on.
You mean a specific theistic interventionist purpose? That's what you're not talking about purpose generically.
Or if there was evidence to me that somehow the direction of dynamics in the universe had any specific direction towards something I would call good or complexity or something.
Well,
if there's any direction, if it looks like things are designed in any way, then I would say purpose, and there's no evidence of design.
Actually, if you look at evolution, and I want to emphasize, I'm talking about a strictly mechanistic view of evolution by natural selection, period.
Sure.
If you look at evolution and the subsequent kind of cultural evolution it gives rise to in the human species, there are people, including me, who believe, first of all, that actually the evolution of intelligent life was fairly likely. Once you've got intelligent life, the trajectory we've seen is fairly likely.
Really likely?
Yeah, I do. And I'm not alone. I mean,
Based on what evidence?
read a chapter in my book, Non-Zero.
No,
read the whole thing.
I mean, it seems to me we have a sample of one, so I think it's...
Well, okay, generically, the
took 4 billion years to do it, too.
Generically, the number of thresholds that have to be passed to get you to intelligent life that have been passed multiple times independently. So like multicellular life has been invented many times. You know, the things that we think of as, you know, helping us evolve toward intelligence, like grasping appendages. There's a whole lot of these things.
It's a fascinating question, because if the dinosaurs hadn't been killed 6,000 years ago, I was just talking to my daughter about this today. Would there have been intelligent reptiles? It's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know the answer.
That part is just 100% conjecture. Anyway, it's an argument. There are evolutionary biologists who agree with me and some who don't, but let me just...
It's a fascinating question. I just don't think we know enough to know the answer.
So, if evolution naturally carries us to higher levels of sentience, first of all, given the fact that subjective experience, so far as I can tell, is the source of meaning on this planet, it's because animals can experience pain and pleasure that life has meaning and love and so on.
So hold on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's the middle of the sentence.
I'm not sorry to interrupt.
Let me finish the sentence, Lawrence. Then what that means is that if you accept the premise of directionality, again, read my book Non-Zero or other things. Dan Dennett agrees with me on the likeliness of intelligent life, by the way.
But you said directionality. You make it evolution has no natural direction. Evolution has no natural direction at all. That's what upsets me, because what you're doing is promulgating a myth about evolution. It has no directionality.
It's a complicated
It depends on natural selection.
Yes, it does.
So, in fact, if there were different conditions on the Earth, then the direction of evolution would be anti-intelligence. Because if the conditions of the Earth were such that only single-celled life could exist, then natural selection would, anytime multicellular life arose, it would die. So, I mean, to argue that that evolution has some direction towards complexity or intelligence is to vastly misrepresent what I think evolution is now. Now, you know, you'll have to get Richard Dawkins to see. I mean, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but it just depends on conditions of natural selection. On Earth, conditions were such that intelligence arose, but there could have been vastly different conditions which would ensure that evolution would imply that intelligence would never arise.
So you say, you know, I've thought about this, I've argued with people, I've written about it, people look, there's an argument going on.
Well, I think I said what I meant, and you have to ask me where I'm wrong.
And anyway, let me finish the thought. If you agree, and I made this, the idea that there's a kind of directionality, if a mechanistic one, in biological evolution and in cultural evolution is when I made a book length in Non-Zero. Read it. If you disagree, get back to me.
Well, I gave you my argument. You have to tell me what's wrong with it. I mean,
we don't have all night, and it's a complicated question. I'm just trying to give people the big picture.
If the temperatures were 1,000 degrees, you'd find that natural selection would not.
Obviously.
Okay, well, that's
many inhospitable.
Then it doesn't have a directionality in that case.
Well,
the directionality is quite different.
If life can't go anywhere, it won't go anywhere. You know.
No, you could imagine you could imagine life forms existing, but complex multicellular life forms based on biochemistry of carbon would certainly not arise. So, as a physical fact, whatever forms of natural selection might result in a self-replicating entity that utilized energy from the environment.
For the moment, I'm talking about evolution on this planet. We don't know how many planets are like this. I'm talking about evolution on this planet. Let me just finish the thought. If you accept an argument that I've made at length, that biological evolution is likely to lead to greater complexity, ultimately intelligence, intelligent life, for reasons I could argue, and don't have time to, is likely to carry social evolution. We'll argue about it over dinner. I'm happy to.
Yeah, we will.
Social evolution to higher and higher levels. You get a couple of things. First of all, natural selection is like a machine for generating more meaning in the sense of more conscious life, capable of things like love. Secondly, interestingly, and this is, by the way,
it's wonderful how from wrong premises you can rise.
I just realized this is going to masterfully bring us back to where we kind of started.
Okay.
And cultural evolution, for intelligible reasons, tends to carry, but mainly by virtue of technological evolution, tends to carry society to higher and higher levels, hunter-gatherer, chieftain, city-state, and so on. Now, let me just finish. Now we are on the verge of a global civilization. My own view is that closing the deal, cementing social cohesion at the global level, is going to call for further moral progress on the part of humans. We may fail, but that will involve, among other things, getting better at looking things from the point of view of other people. And now is where it masterfully comes back to the point of origin. I think it's going to involve not gratuitously insulting large groups of people, especially when right-wing politicians are telling us we're in a clash of civilizations. And we know for a fact that some of these people are causing trouble and are terrorists, are motivated by the sense that the West disrespects them and has no respect for their civilization. So
right,
wasn't that amazing? Wasn't that amazing?
Yeah, we agree, because I think the worst gratuitously insulting people is to tell people that you're absolutely right because your God is right and theirs wrong. So I think you're absolutely right. No, you're not saying it. No, but I think you're absolutely right. The best way we'll come to be moral is by getting rid of all organized religions, which would claim that they have a monopoly on truth, and then we'll have a much better world. Absolutely.
You know, I can imagine a perfectly satisfactory world with no religion. I don't think that if you really want to get rid of it in a reasonably peaceful way, the fastest way is to go around grabbing people and saying, don't you understand, your God doesn't exist.
Oh, I think that's probably true. I think the way to do it, if you care, I mean, it's not my purpose, but one way to do it is to get people so excited about reality that they don't need the myths. And that's what I try and do. The real world is so much more exciting than the myths, that I try and point out to people how exciting the real world is, and then maybe they can find even spiritual wonder and joy from just looking at a Hubble Space Telescope picture. And so I think you're absolutely right. I don't think the best way to lead to enlightenment is to tell people they're stupid. That's probably true.
Tell your friends Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. Anyway, we close on a note of concord. I also am in favor of wonder, joy, and all the good things you mentioned. So we can go to Q&A now.
Yeah. So another Q&A.
Sir, in the front row.
Yeah.
By the way, are you John Horgan, the famous science writer?
As if there's no fix. Is the fix in here? You know.
I've actually read Lawrence's book. So the question I have for you is about...
Yeah, you need a microphone, John.
You need a microphone.
Thanks. The question I have for you is about certain trends in modern physics, the popularity of string theory, which was hard to test 25, 30 years ago when it first emerged. It looks even harder to test now. Also, multiverse theories are very popular. Those also look possibly never really testable.
Oh, no, I think they're much easier to test now than when I wrote my book 5 years ago.
So that was the question, is whether from a marketing point of view, if you're trying to present science as a great alternative to religion, whether it's a bad idea for some very prominent scientists to be trafficking in theories that are extremely speculative and criticized even by physicists and cosmologists.
Well, I think scientists always have a problem when they overreach. Because it comes, and so that's not true just for scientists, true for anyone, because it comes back to bite you. As you're no doubt aware, I was called a critic of string theory. I'm not a critic of string theory. I'm a critic of the hyperbole in the public presentation of string theory. So, as I like to say, some of my best students are string theorists. I wouldn't want my daughter to marry one, but some of them. And by that I mean, so string theory. And I wrote a whole book about its motivation. There are really good motivations for doing string theory. What the problem was when people presented it as something that had done something, and it hadn't. And from a physics perspective, it's an incredibly interesting and exciting idea, but it hasn't yet achieved anything that the other aspects of science that we should celebrate have achieved. There's a tremendous amount we know about the world, and I think, as I wrote in that book or another book, it's a shame that more people know what superstrings are than superconductivity, which actually is kind of fascinating. So absolutely, I would agree that we should never promote something as more than it is. And the science books I have the hardest problem are when people present their pet theories as if there's something profound, and I think that's irresponsible on the whole. And it's not. But I'm not castigating any particular author. There's some I'm castigating, others aren't. There's some people who find it fascinating, and they think there's a progression. And as I say, one of my books, Hiding in the Mirror, is some sense about string theory, about the fascination with extra dimensions, while pointing out there's no evidence whatsoever there are extra dimensions. But why are we fascinated by those things? And as I said, I will say this, my friend Brian Greene, long ago when I first said it, got very upset on the stage in New York when I first said it, which is that calling string theory a theory is a disservice to evolution. because string theory isn't a theory. But Brian says that now. He's come around. It's not a theory. You know, it's very good for him for a while, but I mean, but I think it's really important. It's not a theory, and we do a disservice to science by lumping it in to quantum theory or general relativity as a theory. So yeah, I think it is, but I don't think that's generic on the whole. And by the way, multiverses are, the big difference, of course, between string theory and religion. So people say string theory is religion, and there's a huge difference. String theory is well motivated. I mean, there's a real set of rational reasons for exploring it. There's no rational reason for inventing these myths. There was irrational reasons when 2,000 years ago people didn't have scientific explanations of anything. But so string theory is well motivated. But when it comes to multiverses, in fact, I argued, and in fact it could be, that had a certain result been clearly correct, the discovery of gravitational waves that were from inflation, it could have given unambiguous, indirect evidence for the existence of other universes. In exactly the same ways that we understood the existence of atoms well before we could ever see atoms. So I was quite excited by that possibility. It turns out that result may not be correct, but it could be in the next few years that we will be able to test the ideas of evolution, come down with a mathematical model which we can test in 50 different ways, where the 51st prediction of that model is that there must be other universes. And I find that fascinating and empirically interesting. It turns metaphysics into physics, as far as I'm concerned.
Other questions in the very back there, or almost very back, with the Metallica T-shirt on? I always call on people with Metallica T-shirts on.
I appreciate that. I'm glad that you kind of reconcile science and philosophy in a way. I find that it's a common attitude among many scientists that philosophy is kind of outmoded because of the advances the science has made over the past century or so.
In certain areas, I agree with them. Philosophy of physics is outmoded in the sense, and this probably upsets David Albert, but there are certain areas of science. See, philosophy is the birth of science. So what philosophy does is begin to formulate questions which can lead to productive answers. And so the natural philosophy was well defined as natural philosophy. When it came to physics, those questions were important. But where physics is now, the philosophical questions are just, they don't drive the field. That's not a pejorative statement. It's a fact. It's just nothing any philosopher does right now affects what's happening at the forefront of physics. And that's just the way it is. That doesn't mean those questions aren't of interest to philosophers, but they're not of interest to physicists. One of the reasons most physicists can't spell philosophy.
Okay, well, I guess my issue is the disconnect.
But in neuroscience, by the way, there's an area where my friend Dan Dennett works, where we understand much less, and philosophers can play a much more useful role in framing those questions. So, you know, I mean, I'm often stereotyped as hating philosophy because I have to make jokes, but there are certain areas where it's incredibly important and useful to frame questions. And we all do philosophy.
Exactly.
Whenever so anyway, I don't need to tell you that. Okay.
But yeah, essentially, I believe there's a huge disconnect between scientific discourse and the vast majority of people on Earth. And
that's one of the reasons why I do what I do.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons is that scientists often, in fundamental ways, fail to understand the human condition in ways that to somebody who studies philosophy is pretty self-evident. For instance, Stephen Hawking made this statement that if we were to make contact with extraterrestrials, it would lead to a lot of atheists. And that to me was extremely...
It would lead to what?
A lot of people becoming atheists.
He also said we shouldn't make contact with extraterrestrials, by the way. He likes to make a lot of statements. They all make news.
But to me, that was incredibly naive because I could easily imagine going back a millennium and saying, well, perhaps if we discovered that the Earth was round, a lot of people would be atheists. Obviously didn't happen. If we discovered that the Earth was not the center of the universe, it would make a lot of people atheists. Didn't happen. So my question is essentially...
Yeah, I think you're right there. I mean, I think it would cause people to... It would change the dialogue, but I suspect the people who need religion would not stop needing religion.
Yeah, same here. But my question is, how do you kind of bridge that gap? Because a big criticism of Spinoza, which to me is one of the greatest atheists, whether he directly identified as that or not, is that the criticism that he failed to understand the role that religion had in people's lives, that it fulfilled so many needs that humanity has that a purely rational scientific view just doesn't feel. It may feel it for you or I, but it doesn't really feel that need for the vast majority of people. So how do
yeah.
you then you bridge that gap between what humans kind of need on a deeply, perhaps unconscious level and what science offers?
Okay,
Well,
thank you.
to be honest, no, it's a good question.
No,
I can answer
I said thank you.
Oh, I thought you meant
That's what I
was-
say to good questions. To bad questions, I say that's a bad question.
Oh, I see. Sometimes, okay. Sometimes I thought people say thank you when you think someone made a statement and you want to move on. Okay. But that was a question. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyway, so there's a matter, it's just a matter of communication. So, it is true that it is hard for people for whom the things that religion provides to many people doesn't provide it to them for them to empathize. Okay, so it's empathy. But I think so what we have to do is be honest about it. We have to be honest, recognize that there are things that religion provides, ask why it provides those things, and ask the question, is that the only way to provide those things? And I think that's a much more productive way of dealing with it. I happen to, and I'll be upfront about that. My big point is that I think that there's nothing that religion provides that a real, honest view of the world couldn't provide under the right conditions. Solace, consolation, group. We could all have quantum mechanics classes every Sunday, although my preference would be rock concerts. So I think that people tell me religion brings people together every Sunday, and of course it does. It builds a sense of community, but there are other ways of building a sense of community. And what about a sense of meaning? Well, the fact that the universe has no meaning doesn't mean you don't have any meaning. Okay? You make your own meaning, and to me that's much more profoundly more energizing than the statement that someone else defines your meaning. You defining your meaning makes every action you do more precious. And so I could be a preacher and argue those kind of things, which I do sometimes. So I think you can frame those arguments in a way that at least cause people to think about that. And again, all I can do is cause people to think. They have to decide for themselves whether that works. But you're absolutely right that many of the ways we speak, and I don't want to generalize scientists in general, appear to be alienating, appear to not understand, and are patronizing, appear to suggest that people who are religious are stupid. That's an unfortunate thing that we should avoid.
Okay, can I just say one thing on that point? I do think among some prominent atheists, I won't call them new atheists, there's a tendency, I get the sense that these are people who have no trouble with life. They're happy and they have no trouble living with a completely secular worldview, and that's fine. I do think there are people who have some trouble with life. I actually count myself among them. I don't find life that easy. Some people help themselves through life with things like prayer or meditation or whatever. My own inclination is to leave them to their own devices. I think some people, I've seen cases where people who otherwise might have died from substance abuse problems seem to have been saved by prayer and things like that. So that's one reason I'm just not disdainful of anyone who's practicing any religious tradition and not bothering anybody else. My own view is that, can I just finish? I'll tell you when I'm done. My own view is that you should judge people by their behavior and not their beliefs, and we would all get along a lot better if we just held people accountable for their behavior. And that's enough. The world is complicated enough. And finally, let me finish. I want to say a word about theology, because I think sometimes you get, when quote, new atheists are ridiculing theology, they have a kind of arguably antiquated notion of what it is, or at least a selective notion. So they kind of have in mind kind of fundamentalist theology or whatever. And I just want to say, we're at Union Theological Seminary, and I don't know how many people know, but Union was kind of the epicenter of so-called liberal theology in the 20th century. Liberal meaning not necessarily politically liberal, although there turns out to be a correlation between being a liberal theologian and being politically liberal, but actually meaning, kind of involving liberal interpretations of Scripture, of whatever. And at some point, theology becomes so liberal that the difference between it and philosophy is not all that clear. Paul Tillich was here at Union, and he defined God as the ground of being. Now, he was accused of being an atheist. Maybe he was. And it could be
What
that
an accusation.
it could be that what some theologians are actually involved in is, you know, you once asked me on Blogging Heads, well, what knowledge, what has theology added to the knowledge about the world? And I don't really
No
think
one's
that,
given me an answer to that
I don't
question.
think that's what theology is about. I think you're misunderstanding.
And
There may
universities
be
should-
kinds of theology that are, but I think certainly modern liberal theology is about helping people find a source of moral orientation and meaning that is actually, in many cases, not incompatible with science. That's what a certain amount of liberal theology has been about, is a response to the scientific revolution. That's why God
Why is it called theology,
is
then?
defined in increasingly non-anthropomorphic terms. Well, it gets back to the fact that...
Theology. Why is it called philosophy? Or, I mean, I don't... with all deference to this beautiful building, I don't think any self-respecting university should have a theology department because it hasn't contributed anything as a field to knowledge. Philosophy has, psychology has, but no one has given me an answer yet for, in the last 500 years, any bit of knowledge that theology has given.
As I said, I don't think that's what a lot of modern
I think it's
theology
philosophy.
is about.
It's philosophy.
Well, I'm saying that the line is kind of blurring, and in a certain but I think theology is maybe more mindful of helping people preserve any valuable sources of meaning and moral orientation that they have. And maybe all it is a graceful transition to an ultimately atheistic world. I don't know. What I do know is that there are people who need to have a spiritual life. I say let them have it.
I have
Not
a
in the sense
spiritual
that you
life.
might mean let them have it. I
My
mean, let them have
spirituality
their
is better
spiritual
because
life.
mine's related to reality.
Yeah,
But I mean,
but what I'm saying is...
I don't want to usurp spirituality as if it's not somehow related, as if it's different.
Yeah.
I mean, look, besides enjoying pushing your buttons and...
you are, look, can I just pay you a compliment? You're really good at it.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, you make my wife look like a toad.
I think it's important for people like me sometimes to not give way when people use colloquial definitions that permeate a falsehood or propagate one. And I think that the notion that spirituality is somehow separate from science is a notion that I disagree with incredibly. So that's why I interrupt, because I think if I don't, it gives and that's why I try. I think there are terms that are used that people like me need to say, hold on, all the time, because if we don't and make pests of ourselves, then they just. Anyway, that's part of the reason. Besides the fact I really do enjoy pushing your buttons, but I do agree with you about beliefs and actions, and I've written that. And in fact, a good friend of mine.
People can't follow their behavior and let them believe what they want as long as they're not hurting anybody?
except for the following. And I've had this dialogue with Noam Chomsky, and you can watch it on TV to see it because we did it at my institute in Arizona. We've done it privately. He said to me, I don't care what people believe, it's what they do that counts, and that's true. But the important thing is what people believe affects what they do, and to not recognize that is if every man was an island, to use that thing, then I wouldn't care what people believe. But what people believe, if they're parents, or if they're teachers, or if they're heads of organizations, impacts what they do. And therefore, you have to ask, therefore beliefs are of some concern because they do produce actions.
Right. And if the fact that beliefs do influence behavior is the reason you think a religion generically should be criticized, then I would say, again, that rests on the premise that religion is on balance bad, which in turn is a proposition that not a single so-called new atheist has treated with anywhere near the rigor that a question like that deserves.
Well,
they just
we're always accused of not treating
point
things
to the
with
worst
rigor.
things in the world associated with religion, and I welcome the moment when.
Well, I think Steve Pinker addressed the question very well in his book. The Better Angels of Our Nature. No, do you not think Steve Pinker did a really good, detailed job looking at this question in the Better Angels of Our Nature? Which I think was a very rigorous and interesting book.
And by the way, I mean, he's pointing to a kind of moral progress through history, which to some people would suggest the possibility of purpose if realized through a strictly materialistic process.
He points out that the science and the Enlightenment produced that, is what he argues.
Well,
and
no, that's
rational
not incompatible.
thinking.
That's not incompatible, because these are all part of a material process.
But you know what? I don't think it's that religion should be criticized. It's the point is that religion can be criticized. That's the point.
It certainly can be criticized. We agree there.
Yeah. Are you? Yeah.
I'm flattered they want to hear me.
Okay.
Well, you haven't said anything yet. We're reserving judgment.
Talking about the new atheists, if you, speaking for myself, and a lot of atheists that I know, and there's some people I see from around here who I know from the atheist movement, the job is not to try to convince religious people that they shouldn't be religious, because that's impossible. I mean, if you live in a literate society like ours, and you reach the age of 21, and you believe in God, then you're not thinking rationally. It's like a 4-year-old believes in Santa Claus. A 10-year-old believing in Santa Claus, she'd say, what the hell's with this kid? Because it's obvious. So the reason why we have an atheist movement is not to change those people, because you give them a logical argument, their thinking is not logical or rational. It's a matter of faith. It's an emotional thing. And sometimes very intelligent people can be religious. And atheists can be very stupid sometimes. But not in...
Present company
not
excluded.
in this way. He does push buttons.
Okay.
No, so what was it? Where was it? Oh yeah. So
You were going to ask a question, I think.
well, I was going to say something. See your reaction to it. What we're doing is trying to protect atheists. Atheists are a despised group. For example, if I have on my car "Jesus saves" or some other claptrap, don't think anything of it. But if I have on my car, "There is no God, I am an atheist," I'm worried about my car getting scratched.
Well, that's wrong and bad, and I certainly, and I recognize, I think it's true. I mean, I was certainly in a minority in high school in Texas in my belief system, you might say. And I was much closer here into the spectrum than almost everyone else in my high school, so I know that. And I also know, and this is something I learned when I debated Sam Harris in Los Angeles. Richard Dawkins was there, and I realized, I mean, he has such an ardent following. And by the way, we didn't have time to get into certain properties of religious movements that arguably the New Atheists have, but very ardent following. And I realized that one thing that motivates it is there are people who feel that they were really damaged by a religious upbringing, and I don't doubt that that happens. Now, maybe that in some cases these are parents who would have damaged them with any, belief system, whatever. But I don't doubt that that happens, and it certainly should not be the case that you have to hang your head in shame for being atheist. It certainly shouldn't be the case that you have to hang your head in shame for arguing for atheism.
Right.
What's that?
Or even being a Republican, say.
Well, I think you've gone too far now.
Yeah, that's right.
There are some things that should be stigmatized. So I mean, don't get me wrong. I just think that the kind of the attitude we see on the part of some new atheists is, in important respects, counterproductive and rests on simple-minded premises about whether religion is generically, good or bad.
Well, hold on. Okay, but of course that's a vast generalization, which I'm sure which is, and also a facile one, which I know you're totally opposed to. You want rigorous thought, but to say atheism is based on this.
No, I said some. What I meant to say was some new atheists are making manifestly facile assertions about religion generally because they don't back it up with rigorous argument.
Well, some may be, but some don't.
And some may be Sam Harris, and some may be the late Chris Hitchens.
I think
and some may be Richard Dawkins.
Well, Christopher's book is backed up with a great deal. I mean,
I read it and debated him. I have a different view.
Okay.
No point in
now,
here.
I hope you won't say later that you debated me, because first of all, I don't enter debates in general. I have dialogues and discussions, and I don't think this was a debate. It was a discussion.
No, I don't recall any divergences of opinion.
Okay, so we didn't have a debate, but in any case, I think Christopher's book is a masterpiece in many ways, and an enlightening one. And he was a good friend, so I'm biased, well, he actually became a good friend because of that book, so maybe I'm not so biased. But I think the point is not just so much defending atheism. I think you need to just make it normal, and that's, I think, the main purpose of these standard bearers, if you wish. And you mentioned movement. I'm not part of a movement. I don't like to be part of anything that will have me as a member, right? And so
Groucho Marx.
Absolutely. And so I don't think of some movement. All I'm trying to do, and I spend most of my time doing other things, but when I'm called upon, is to just make it normal, is to point out that you can, that you can be a thinking, reasonable person, and moreover, that there are interesting questions that should cause you to doubt your faith. In fact, I wrote a piece, which you didn't quote, which I said, I think the purpose of teaching, and we should, in every high school in this country, encourage children to doubt their faith. Because just like we should encourage them to doubt absolutely everything else, we should teach them to doubt what their parents tell them, doubt what their teachers tell them, and doubt, because that is a central part of becoming a thinking person.
Well, I certainly think we should teach science. I think if we specifically encourage them every day in school to doubt their parents, you may see the public funding of public education begin to dry up.
Yeah.
But whatever you think will work. So I think, first of all, you know, we should feel flattered that as many people have stuck around as have. I should take. Let's quickly. If somebody can ask a question in like 30 seconds or less, vows to be able to, then let's pick on them and just choose two of them, right? And for convenience, let's make them in the same place. Quick questions, ask them in succession, and then we'll get a response to both of them and then adjourn right here, these two.
Okay.
The young man.
Well, that's not fair.
What's not fair?
Well, I mean, let's ask each person to have a question and answer it, because whenever two people ask things in succession, one person's question gets subsumed in my experience.
Right, but like I'm imagining the average length of a Lawrence Krauss answer, and I'm doing the math.
I know yours seemed much longer to me, but I think it's because, anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
So my question is two parts and addressed towards Robert. Firstly, I believe you have some misconceptions about evolution. Doesn't natural selection simply favor the organisms which are most successful at replicating under their given habitat, and that's not necessarily towards multicellular life or complexity? And lastly, repeating a word over and over again more loudly isn't a definition for it, so could you please define nothing?
Okay. And then the...
Those are questions I asked him, too, so it's good. Maybe you'll get an answer.
Hi. Dr. Krauss, would you say that science basically undercuts not only religion, but a lot of the secular people who say, oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, and they believe in things like past lives, psychic powers, and stuff like that? Like I saw Sean Carroll at the Amazing Meeting a couple years ago, and he just basically threw cold water on all that, and it was...
Well, science throws cold water on those things which disagree with empirical evidence, and which are unfounded on the basis of which make claims which aren't supported by empirical evidence, and that includes all of that nonsense. And I wrote a book a long time about that. But it doesn't cast water on spirituality. As I say, what I'd like to do is subsume it. I mean, the spirituality of science is profoundly spiritual, and so I think we make a mistake. As people make a mistake by claiming that science has no ethics, no spirituality, no all of the things that they claim science isn't. We at our peril accept, and that's why I interrupt when people start to say those things. Anyway, you can answer the first question.
Okay, on nothing, I mean, I think the way a modern philosopher would describe it for purposes of addressing the why is there something around a nothing question would be something like, you know, no physical laws, nothing that can be described as a physical stuff or physical system, including relativistic quantum fields with some kind of vacuum, nothing, no space-time. Now, that's kind of hard to imagine, which is kind of the point. But
I wrote a book about it.
But it seems conceivable that it could have been that way. I mean, there is stuff here, and the question is, why is there stuff? And I think some of them mean it as why, some of them may mean it as how. But if you mean it as how, I think the point is, well, if you start positing some sequence by which nothing in that sense becomes something, you'll find you can't do it. Because there's no laws, no physical stuff to operate on, and so you can speculate, oh, it could arise spontaneously, but that spontaneous is another word for we don't have any idea what we're talking about.
That's another word for people who don't understand quantum mechanics. Okay, I'm serious. The point the point is various classical notions of logic and meaning are changed, but They're changed because not because we wanted to change them, because the universe forced us to change them. And so you shouldn't presume that those ancient or colloquial common sense notions are true. Common sense is not a good guide. It's a good guide maybe to, you think, direct human experience, but it's not a good guide to how the universe works.
Well, anyway, I mean, my final word on that is when somebody says something could have arisen from that true nothingness I just described spontaneously, we don't have time to adjudicate this. Just sounds like total hand-waving.
Well, then you'd be...
It could have. I guess it could have.
Hold on. Then to the young man's second question. There are a lot of people who say, in fact, Ben Carson, the ultimate ignorant person, said...
No, wait.
I mean, the person who doesn't understand basics of science.
There's so much competition for that title in the Republican field alone.
No, but if I had to pick the person who was the most ignorant about science in that Republican field, it would be Ben Carson. But anyway, what he would say, he said exactly the same thing you just said about evolution. I can't see how you can create life from no life. I can't see how you can create complex human beings. He said if you can understand how you can create the human mind from evolution, that's something
well, you know
nothing. It seems to me,
you know what his problem
used that same outmoded argument.
I can explain how evolution works by reference to scientific laws operating on physical systems.
But you can't explain how the beta brain evolved.
If you imagine true nothingness, you can't explain it that way.
Hold on. We don't know. No. But there's a big point. No one knows right now
we
the
may be
steps by
testing
which
your
the
patience
human brain evolved. But we all recognize the plausibility of it evolving. And as this young man just pointed out, the steps are quite simple, and they don't have any directionality, but they happen to allow you to understand how a complex system could form in the presence of pressure, of environmental pressures.
So then let me answer his second question about directionality in evolution. This is a question on which reasonable people disagree. The late William Hamilton, who came up with the theory of kin selection of Riemann-Mark theorem, I'm sure you've heard of it, he agreed with me that intelligent life was likely. Stephen Jay Gould disagreed. I've critiqued Stephen Jay Gould's ideas.
You can't argue that something's reasonable because someone else agreed with you. That's an argument that unfortunately I hear too often from philosophers. They quote other philosophers.
I'm not, but since I'm not a professional evolutionary biologist, I can see someone wondering, well, who the hell are you to say? I just want to say there are credentialed, serious people who agree there's a division of opinion. If you ask how could it have a direction if what natural selection is about is kind of getting genes in the next generation, yes, you're right. Those traits that survive are those most conducive to the replication of the genes underlying the traits. That's all that's going on. Now, it turns out that, first of all, as an empirical matter, as an observed matter, life, evolution on this planet at least, is this incredibly creative thing that invents all of these things multiple times independently. But beyond that, we understand some of the dynamics by which complexity grows. For example, and this is ignored, Jerry Coyne, a so-called new atheist, in his latest book gets into this argument, and it seems like he hasn't read anything since Steve Gould wrote 20 years ago, because a good example of something Coyne ignores is the existence of so-called arms races, like within species, and to some extent, probably a lesser extent, between species. But that dynamic puts upward pressure on behavioral complexity through a known mechanism of natural selection that everyone knows about. So there are other reasons to think that in general, when you're in a competitive situation, not just with other species, but with other members of your own species, to get genes in the next generation, behavioral flexibility often pays off.
Behavioral cockroaches will be around when we're gone.
Behavioral flexibility is intelligence.
No, but I think, there's certain things that it's also true that certain systems, like cockroaches, there's pressures that on some systems that produce change, other systems enforce certain.
But let's be clear. If the premise is that intelligent life was likely to evolve, the claim isn't that all species will grow in complexity, although all species have grown in net complexity since the beginning of time, biological time. It is just that at the outer envelope of complexity, if you look at the most complex species on the planet at any time, that tends to, if fitfully, get higher. And it's an established fact in the fossil record that outer envelope has, in fact, gotten higher. We are at the outer envelope. I think I've given you a sense for the kinds of arguments that come into play.
Although it's quite likely just temporarily. But again, you're making, I think your point is a good one. Let me just say that.
Oh, I think we're going to end right here.
But hold on.
Thank you.
But hold on.
Thank you, Lawrence. Let's give Lawrence a big hand.
But the outer envelope goes in both directions, because evolution explores the entire allowed phase space. But the important point to realize is you're also making the assumption that we're somehow the endpoint. It's quite likely.
No.
Well, hold on. It's quite likely that intelligence is a temporary thing. And therefore, in the long run, if the Earth survives up to the 2 billion years before it's about 1,000 degrees, then it's quite likely, it's quite possible. I don't say quite likely. It's a possibility which seems to me as likely as any other possibility that intelligence will end, and there'll still be happily life on Earth. And in that case, I don't see how you can say natural selection will inevitably produce higher complexity, because the life forms that may survive in the long run are less complex.
If your friends continue to insult entire ethnic groups, intelligence may indeed turn out to be a temporary phenomenon, but I hope not, and I hope the human endeavor survives. So listen, Lawrence, we're going to close on a note of concord, friendship, and amity.
Yes.
And I just want to say